So just to start, I always like to get an idea of who we have in the audience. So how many first-year PhD students? Okay, second year, third or final year? Okay, so we've got a bit of a mix of everyone from different stages. And is everyone from this department, so applied mathematics, or do we have anyone from outside? Okay, good to know. Okay, so now that I kind of know who you are, a little bit about myself. So my own background was in physics, starting way back in 1999, which shows a little bit my age. I'm very aware that at some point in the not too distant future, there'll be people in my talks who were born after I started my own PhD. I don't think we're quite at that stage yet, but it's getting close. Bachelor's degree in physics, which led into a master's degree in nanoscale science and technology before going straight into a PhD, which was really, really difficult for many reasons. And I almost reached the point of quitting at one point because it was so stressful, which is a story I'll get into a little bit later. But I managed to turn things around, get the results I needed, write my thesis pretty quickly. And then that led into a couple of postdoc positions, first in France and then in Spain. But I realized I didn't want to stay on the academic track. And around the same time, I was working with a lot of PhD students who were much better physicists or scientists than I was. But when it came to the writing, they were absolutely terrified. And so for me, it had been the other way around. The research was really difficult. The writing was the easy part. And this led into basically me developing my own job where I was coaching PhD students, initially just in writing, but then I realized that everything else is connected to it too. So the project management, the psychological side, and all sorts of other things. So basically since 2010, this is what I've been doing full time. So I've seen most situations before and tried to develop ways of overcoming a lot of those common and less common problems as well. So one of the things that is it changing? Come on. Okay. One of the things that I've observed is, as a major source of difficulty, is the differences between the kind of study that you do to get you into a PhD and the PhD itself. So when you are doing an undergraduate degree, or really all of the study that leads up to that, so all the way through school, you have a very clear structure, very clear timetable, very clear syllabus, and basically everybody does the same. So as long as you do what you're told to do, you generally do quite well. So those skills of being able to follow an externally imposed structure get you into a PhD. But once you reach that level, once you're accepted onto a PhD program, you have to set your own agenda and you have to manage your own project, which is exceptionally difficult to do. So the skills that get you into a PhD are not necessarily the same skills that help you to succeed. So often people end up struggling, people end up overworked, and there is often this desire or this feeling that people are not getting enough done, and so they want to get more done with the time available. They want to be more efficient or more productive with the time available. Very, very common feeling. However, there is a deeper issue, which is the feeling of frustration that comes with feeling like you're not doing well enough, or maybe even that you're not good enough. And what people are often really trying to do, other than the surface level of trying to get more done, is to develop a feeling of control over the outcome, and at an even deeper level than that, a feeling of safety. Because when people invest so much of themselves in doing a PhD, there's a certain amount of identity that gets tied up in that, right? I think that I should be a good scientist or a good mathematician or whatever it is you're studying. And so if it's starting to go wrong, it starts to eat away in some cases, that sense of self, right? That you are the good student, that you are the good academic. So when we dig deeper into these problems, there are often psychological issues underneath the practical. So the typical solutions that people go for, there's basically two broad approaches. One is simply working harder for longer. So if you're not getting enough done, simply do more. Or being more organized, using techniques of time management, planning, organization, those kind of things. However, there are obvious limitations to working harder for longer hours. So when you try to extend your working day, it will inevitably affect other areas of your life. It can start to affect sleep, social contact, your relationships. That certainly was the case in my own PhD. Your hobbies, the things that you do outside of the PhD, the things that you enjoy in life, and also exercise and diet as well. And all of these things affect your mental and physical health, which in turn affect your ability to do the work. So then maybe you feel like you need to work even more, and that then can become a really, really bad cycle where you're already sleep deprived, but you feel like you need to get more done, so you work even longer hours and everything starts to fall apart. So this is obviously has a lot of limitations to it, but there's often this assumption that this is normal, this is just what you have to do. So people end up massively stressed, but then that's so common that people assume that it's inevitable and necessary part of the process and you have to suffer in order to succeed. But you're academics, you're not Navy SEALs. So it's not about learning to just endure and to get through it. So a PhD, it requires a high level of thought. You're dealing with really difficult problems. So working to exhaustion simply makes no sense. And to perform at a high level, you need to look after yourself and you need to manage your effort and your recovery. So instead of taking the Navy SEAL boot camp approach, where it's just, I'm just going to work longer hours, I'm going to suffer my way through this. If you think of yourself more like a professional athlete, so it's not just about training as hard as you can all the time and working to exhaustion, but managing your efforts and your recovery so that you can perform at the highest level that you can. So there will be periods, inevitably, when maybe you do need to work a little bit longer. Maybe you've got a really big deadline. Maybe you've got a conference presentation. Maybe there's a few things that are happening which mean you just have to work longer hours. However, that's not sustainable in the long term. So what you need to do is then, once you've got through that particular period, then ease off, relax, recharge your batteries. And I think this is a fundamental thing that you need to take into account and you need to make time for. So if we follow this approach of limiting your working hours or building in rest and recovery, so we're working less instead of working more, or at least working a prescribed amount and trying not to go over that, then you need to make sure that you're making the best possible use of the time when you are actually working. So this is where organization and time management starts to play a role. So we've got all of these kind of techniques that I'm sure you're familiar with, that you will have used many times. So you've got to-do lists, you've got weekly and monthly plans or timetables. Maybe you put in deadlines. There'll be some external ones, but maybe you impose some deadlines yourself. And also putting in measurable targets and giving yourself possibly some kind of accountability as well. Now, all of these tools can be useful, but there are two major problems with them. One is that they give you that feeling of control that I was talking about earlier as a deeper motivation, they give you that feeling of control before you've actually achieved anything. So it's really easy to sit down and create a beautiful color-coded Gantt chart with deadlines for every single task or every single milestone. And it feels really, really good. It feels like you're getting some control over the process. But then if you don't stick to that plan, then it becomes, instead of a useful tool that helps you to decide what to do or helps to motivate you, it can become a psychological burden because it's a reminder of a standard that you've set yourself that you're then failing to live up to. And then it feels like you've got to work harder to catch up on the goals and you're back in that same cycle. Or in some cases, people just kind of lose all motivation and kind of disengage. So although plans and timetables are useful, there are also risks to them as well. So one of the things that we need to accept when we're approaching this issue of kind of project management in research is that the nature of research and really life more generally is that there are some things that you can partially control and many that you can't. So if you're trying to gain control simply by putting in a plan, there's no obligation of the universe to sort of follow that plan, right? So the feeling of control that you initially get is a bit of an illusion. So you can plan as much as you like, but you'll never be able to control everything. And in some extreme cases, I've spoken to students who've spent literally years planning their research, putting together a proposal, really in an attempt to come up with the perfect plan so that they avoid any mistakes. But mistakes really are an inevitable and necessary part of the process if you want to develop your skills as a researcher and if you want to make any kind of discovery. So we need to accept that some of the things that we do, we're not going to get the result that we want, or maybe at least not straight away, and we need to take that into account in any kind of planning situation. It's not just about mistakes, though. There are all kinds of things that can go wrong. Equipment can break, or maybe it will arrive late. Computers crash. Participants, if you're doing a particular kind of research, can drop out. Papers can be rejected. Other researchers can scoop you and beat you to a particular result. It's outside of your control. There could be funding cuts. Your supervisor might leave. There could be political issues that could be within your department or more generally with things like Brexit affecting funding or other things that you can't control. And of course, pandemics or other natural disasters, which are far too big for you to control that you have to respond to, and just life events in general. So when you take all these things into account, the one thing that we can really say with certainty is that research never goes perfectly to plan, and there are always problems that you cannot anticipate. So I like this quote. It's from a military strategist, I think from the 19th century, that no battle plan ever survives first contact with the enemy. Same thing is true of research. No research plan ever survives first contact with reality. I usually avoid these absolute statements like never and always, but in this case, I stand by it because I've still not come across a single research project that has gone perfectly to plan. What we see in published papers is a very tidied up version of events where we have this problem, we had this plan, we implemented it perfectly, and here's the result, right? So you don't see all the mess that goes on in the background while it's actually happening. So if we can't control all of these external factors, we can't control the outcome of research. All we can control is ourselves and our own reaction to events. But even this could be a bit of an illusion because much of our behavior and much of our reactions to things that happen are subconscious. And they're driven by habits, so what you've tended to do before, or in some cases, deep-rooted beliefs, which are built up over an entire lifetime, again, many of which may be subconscious. And especially when under stress, these are the things that tend to dominate. Right? These are the things that we tend to revert to. So when something goes wrong and you're in a bit of a panic, often you'll tend to do the things that you always do in those kind of situations. So what can we do? Well, there are ways to create flexible plans to allow for the unexpected, which we'll come to later in the second session. But there's something more fundamental that I think we need to address first. So this is really the main theme of this first session of self-care. And when I talk about self-care, it's not just about doing nice things to cope with or counter or distract from the stress. It's about developing skills and attributes that help you to thrive in difficult conditions. So the reason why we don't just want to distract ourselves from stress or have an escape from it is that stress tends to come back stronger if we don't deal with it. If we just distract ourselves by doing something fun, it's still there in the background and it will come out in surprising ways later. And in terms of this goal of developing the skills and attributes to thrive in difficult situations, this might seem unlikely and it might be enough to just cope and get through, but I think why not aim for this as kind of an ideal? And if you aim for this and you just manage to cope, then that's okay. But I think we should aim a little bit higher than just getting through. And a PhD is ultimately something that you should actually enjoy. That's really what we want to aim for, instead of just that Navy SEAL approach. Okay. So a quick caveat here. So some of the tips that I will give you will be easier for some people to apply than others, depending on personal circumstances. So I don't want to pretend at any point that I've got the perfect solution that works for everybody, because this stuff is really, really, really complicated. But hopefully there'll be things that you can apply, and even if things just help a little bit, then I think I'll be happy that I've done my job. So we're aiming for that goal of thriving in difficult circumstances, but for some people, it'll be harder than others. And also, as I said before we started, really this is just an introduction, and we'll get into the Q&A where we can dive deeper into particular issues that you want to talk about. So I'll keep going for about another 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have loads of time for questions afterwards. Okay, so these skills and attributes that can help you to thrive in difficult conditions. I think there are three main ones that can really help in almost any situation. And these are calm, awareness, and confidence. And these are as alternatives to panic, numbness, and anxiety. So these attributes, whether the positive ones of calm, awareness, and confidence, or the negative ones, they tend to reinforce each other. So if you're in a state of panic and numbness and anxiety, you'll tend to spiral further and further and further down. Whereas if you're calm and you're aware of what you're doing and you're confident, then things can just get better and better. So let's break these down a little bit further. Starting with calm. This is important because we don't tend to make good decisions when we're under stress or when we're in a state of panic. And as I was saying earlier, we tend to follow instincts. We tend to follow the habitual responses that we've developed to difficult situations before. And so what we want to do is kind of interrupt that cycle, bring your level of stress and anxiety down so that you can then respond in a different way. So the first thing I would suggest is reducing the number of things that you're trying to do. So reduce the mental load that you're trying to deal with. ideally down to just dealing with one thing at a time, if you can simplify it to that level, and giving yourself time to think beyond the first option. So if you these habits that I've been talking about that tend to drive your behavior, that's the first thing that will come to mind. So what you need to do is just think a little bit longer. What if I do this instead? What if I react in a different way? And then maybe if you think a little bit longer, then you can think of a third option or a fourth option. So you can see different ways of possibly responding, instead of, say, hitting some kind of problem and then throwing yourself back into the work with the first thing that you think of. Just slow down, take some time to think. Maybe if I try it this way, is often almost always a better way of responding. Because with the kind of research that you're doing, it's not like you have to respond straight away. Nothing bad is going to happen. It's not like you're driving a race car where you've got to respond in a fraction of a second. You've got that time, so you can use it in order to come up with a considered response. Okay, so what we want to be able to do is to return to a calm state when anxiety starts to build. But this relies on an awareness of your state, noticing when the anxiety or the stress is starting to build, and using that as a prompt to take action. This is important. This awareness is important because a lot of the time, especially if stress has been going on for a long time, we stop being aware of it. We kind of become numb to it. We kind of tend to bury it, in order to just keep working or keep functioning at a basic level. So what we have is this background stress that is guiding a lot of what we do. It's determining a lot of our reactions to things that happen, but we're not necessarily aware of how that system is functioning at any given time. So sometimes we'll kind of numb ourselves just through working harder, working for longer. If I just keep going, then it'll be okay. But other times it could be things like distractions like the internet, social media, other things. But then when we do that, as I was saying before, the stress is still there in the background, and it will come out in other surprising ways. So I think developing this kind of awareness is essential to disrupting the kind of compulsive anxiety or stress-driven behavior, but awareness on its own may not be enough. Because you can know what things you need to do, right? You can slow down, you can realize, I'm really stressed, I need to do something differently. But if you're in that stressed and anxious state, you might find it impossible, literally impossible, to follow through on those things that you feel or you really, really should do. Right? There can be these blocks to taking different actions. And I think the key to overcoming these blocks is developing confidence, which I think of as the fundamental belief that we can cope with whatever happens. So this is not the same as believing that you'll succeed. It's not the same. It's not confidence defined by, I know exactly how to do this. If I do these things, then I will get this result. And I have absolute belief that that will be the outcome that I get. It's believing that even if you don't succeed, you'll be able to cope. You'll still be okay. So the alternative is to believe that you can't cope with failure, which makes it very, very difficult to take any risks. And sometimes this can be quite deep-rooted because throughout the education system, you're rewarded based on what you get right, and you're kind of penalized for making mistakes. So every single test that you take, you get graded, you get scored based on the proportion of things that you get right. And often you'll literally be ranked in terms of your value as a student based on what you score. So you're essentially taught that mistakes are a bad thing, right? And to be a good student, you need to get everything right. So sometimes this, these deep-rooted beliefs mean that if you're unsure if this is the right thing to do, then it stops you from actually taking any kind of action. But that, of course, means that you are more likely to fail in the long run. So it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. So the fear of making mistakes makes mistakes and bigger mistakes actually more likely. But if you have the confidence to say, well, it doesn't matter if I make mistakes, I'll be okay no matter what. Even on a larger scale, it's a thing that people don't generally like to think about. But if you said, I'll be okay even if I fail my PhD, I trust in my ability to cope with that, then what you can do is you can fully invest in the process, knowing that you can adapt if necessary. Okay, and this is what I think of as the fundamental kind of confidence that we need to develop, so that you can fully throw yourself into the work. Okay, so in terms of my own PhD and how these elements came together, so I kind of discovered them by accident. So basically, the course of my PhD was pretty rough. So at the end of my first year, I had to change project because it was initially a collaboration with chemistry, and the student in chemistry was supposed to be providing samples, which I was then supposed to characterize. That student left about 9 months into my PhD, and it was only about 3 months later that I actually discovered that, right? So nobody told me, and the supervisor in chemistry stopped replying to emails. All kinds of things went wrong, so I had to change projects at the end of the first year, going into the second. I switched on to another project, which was also challenging. It's kind of an instrument development project where the equipment was breaking down constantly. So these were kind of obvious external challenges, but internally, I wasn't coping with these things very well. One of the reasons was that when I started the PhD, I was just grateful to be accepted. I thought it was, I hadn't been the best undergraduate student. I'd sort of not worked as hard as I possibly should have, but worked a lot harder towards the end. Then got through the master's, and so I was starting to think, oh, maybe I could take this a little bit further. But then when I went into the PhD, I kind of knew that, or I felt that I wasn't as good as a lot of the other students. I felt that maybe I didn't deserve to be there. This was not something that I was necessarily consciously aware of, but it was there in the background. And then as things were going wrong, that belief started to build up. And so even though I was working and I was putting in hours in the lab, really I was doing experiments not really believing that they would work out. And so I was often rushing things. When things went wrong, I would often distract myself by going online. I would check email. Then I would often find myself thinking, well, now I've checked email and it's only half an hour to lunch, so there's no point starting anything new at this point. So I was kind of undermining myself by finding ways of disengaging with the work instead of dealing with the problems that arose. And so I got into my third year, about halfway through my third year. I didn't have any publications. I didn't have the results that I needed. The equipment was breaking down on a regular basis. And there was one day when I was working in the lab, and there were these probes that I was making that were incredibly fragile. There were these optical fibers that was basically a strand of glass, the thickness of a hair. So I'd make these in batches of 20 or 30 and hope that enough survived to do an experiment. So I was about 2 days into this process and I dropped a whole batch of probes. Not the first time that this had happened, but basically if I hadn't gone into work that morning, I would have been further ahead than I actually was as a result. And yeah, so it wasn't the first time this kind of thing happened, but this time something inside me snapped and I swore loudly, stormed out of the lab. And walked across campus thinking, I can't take this anymore. Right? It's so stressful. Nothing I do is working. I'm putting in all of these hours. I'm exhausted. I don't want to do this anymore. So walked across campus, eventually found a nice spot just to sit and think about what I was going to do. And I thought, well, I'm not going to succeed, so I might as well quit. And if I quit, then I'll have to go through this process of, I'll have to tell my supervisor, I'll have to tell my family, I have to tell my friends, I'll have to think of something else that I can do. But I thought, you know what, that's not as bad as staying in this situation, right? I'll be okay, I will think of something. So that kind of took the pressure off, right? That thought that, well, if I quit, I'll be okay, I'll find something. And then I thought, well, actually, there's still one or two things that I could try. Well, I could try doing it this way, I could try doing it this way. So then I decided, well, I'll go back to the lab, I'll try these two things, and if they don't work, then I'll quit. But if whether or not I stay is going to be determined by the results of these two experiments, I want to make sure that I do the absolute best that I possibly can, right? I'm not too worried about the end result. All I'm going to worry about is doing these things slowly, carefully, and with the utmost focus. So when I was ready, calmed myself down, went back to the lab, cleaned up, started again, and basically I slowed down and just did things as carefully as I possibly could. And the experiments worked. And I thought, oh shit, now I can't quit. So what it taught me was that I'd been undermining myself through the belief that I wouldn't actually succeed. So it became this kind of, again, this self-fulfilling prophecy. And so what I did from that point on was just did everything as carefully as I could. So even though I was under a lot of time pressure, my funding was going to run out, and then, I had an absolute hard deadline for submitting the thesis, I decided I'm not going to worry about the end result. I'm not going to worry if the examiners ask me some question that I should have learned as an undergrad, but I didn't show up to that lecture, whatever it was. I don't care. I don't care if they hate my thesis, but I'm just going to do the best that I can, and I'll be okay. And even though obviously not everything worked from that point, I was much better at dealing with things when they went wrong. And instead of checking email to avoid the problem, what I did was I just started taking walks around campus to have a bit of time to think about what I was going to do, instead of following that kind of anxiety-driven approach of, I'm just going to check email and, get through the day. So this was really the difference between success and failure. So I managed to get a couple of publications. I then wrote my thesis kind of with the same attitude. I don't care what the examiners think, I'm just going to do the best that I can. I wrote the whole thesis in just 3 months, passed the Viva with no corrections. That then led into the postdocs, etc., and ultimately, why I'm standing here today. So if I hadn't had this realization, I basically would have quit. My life would have been totally different, on a totally different path. So this calm, this awareness, and this confidence, I think are crucial, not just for research, but for life in general. So bring it back to kind of practical steps that you can follow. When you face a difficulty, when you face a stressful situation, try and create some space and time free from incoming distractions, creating a delay between that initial stress and how you respond. So you give yourself a little bit of time, not just to think about solutions, but also pay attention to what you feel. Pay attention to how stressed you are. You give that feeling a little bit of time and space. Let yourself experience it instead of trying to numb it. And then you'll often find that it just starts to fade away. Then you can think through options and alternatives. So thinking beyond the first thing that comes to mind. Take a decision and take action. Again, bearing in mind that it doesn't matter if it works or not. What matters is taking that action from a calm and confident place. So You can do this in response to difficult situations, but you can also practice this in lower stress settings. So it's actually very difficult to change your behavior once you're under stress because those subconscious behaviors are often so strong. So for me, it took basically a bit of a breakdown to force me to change behavior. But when it's kind of middle level stress, sometimes it's quite difficult. So yeah, you can also practice this in lower stress settings. And this is basically through meditation, right? There's a lot of parallels. So a lot of people think of meditation as just calming the mind, but there's a lot more to it. It can be useful for calming the mind, but you can also use it to train your mind to think and function differently. So the basic technique that you'll come across if you use any of the kind of meditation apps or you look at anything on YouTube is initially just focusing on the breath. So you sit for 10 minutes and you just follow the breath. And anytime your attention wanders, you try to bring your attention back to the breath again. Now the goal of this is not necessarily to stop your attention wandering, but to notice when it's happening and then just bring it back, okay? So you get an idea, if your brain is jumping around all over the place, you're at least aware of it instead of it just happening in the background. And generally, gradually, if you sit there long enough, that will start to settle down. So you can develop this kind of awareness of the distractions that are happening within your own brain. And you can also, again, with a little bit of practice, learn to not get carried away with the thoughts that are arising. Okay, so you notice your thoughts are going in a particular direction, you bring your attention back. Another basic technique that a lot of people will be aware of is doing a body scan. So trying to pay attention not just necessarily to the breath, but the feelings and sensations in your body. So you can do this by starting by paying attention to the sensation in the top of your head, and then gradually moving your attention back all the way down to your feet, and then back up again. And you can start to notice not just the sort of physical sensations, but also how they relate to an emotional state. So I'm sure everyone will have had situations where you're really stressed and your heart rate starts going, or your breathing becomes really shallow, or maybe you have a feeling in the pit of your stomach. And one of the things that's really, really important is to be aware of those things, and then again, so that you can take some action and start to do things differently. And one of the keys here is to practice this kind of awareness when you're not officially meditating, right? So it's all very well sitting for 10 minutes and having a timer, but then it's how you take that awareness as you go about your day. And so regularly kind of checking in with yourself, just see, okay, what's my stress level at? How is my body feeling? And then trying to relax and do something about that. One quick trick, if you do find you notice anxiety building, you can use the breath to calm yourself down. And one of the tricks is to do what's known as a physiological sigh. So you basically take a big breath in, you then take in a little bit more, so you really fill your lungs, and then just letting that breath out really, really slowly, as slowly as you can. And that tends to have a calming effect. If you do that 2 or 3 times, then it starts to reduce the level of stress and anxiety. So these are the basics. This is the beginner stuff, which I think still everybody should do to some extent. But you can also take it to a deeper level and not just think about your state or observe your state in the moment, but kind of do a deep exploration and develop knowledge of yourself and the patterns the mental patterns that you tend to follow. So to give an example from my own life, one of the things that I've realized that I tend to do And this is simply by observing my thought patterns. So not trying to stop my thought patterns, but just observing them kind of from a bit of objective distance. One of the things I'll tend to do is imagine upsetting scenarios that haven't actually happened and having an emotional response to those things. So I'm literally, creating a stressful situation within my own head. There are all sorts of other patterns of behavior, patterns of thought that I've observed, but this is basically just by giving myself some time to sit and kind of really think about what my brain is doing. And then you've got a chance to break those patterns, but it has to come from a place of awareness, realizing that that's something that you tend to do. Once you've got that awareness, once you notice a pattern of thoughts that you tend to get stuck in, you can try to train a new attitude or worldview or way of thinking. So, for example, if you notice you get caught in a train of thought where you're thinking about everything's going wrong in my PhD, I don't know if I'm going to succeed. What if I fail? Then I won't be able to get a job. What will my family think of me? How am I going to pay the bills, etc., etc. If you get caught in that kind of way of thinking, which is inevitably going to affect the way that you work, you can then just try and practice the confidence that you'll be okay. Just remind yourself, actually, if that happens, I'll deal with it. If I don't end up as a professional academic, then I'll find something else. I've got the skills, I've got the ability, I've got the confidence to deal with that. And this is something that I've started doing really in the last few months, is this kind of deeper exploration of what my general thought patterns are, realizing how they limit me in a lot of ways, or they determine my own behavior. And then it's actually, with a bit of practice, not that difficult to start changing those things, which then has quite big effects, positive effects on life. Okay, so a final point on confidence and self-knowledge, and then we'll get into the Q&A. One of the common subconscious beliefs that PhD students have is seeing a PhD as a kind of validation or self-validation. So I need to get the PhD to prove that I'm good enough, either to others or to myself. If you think about that, if your self-worth, your self-value is tied up in the results of the PhD, then it can be a really, really dangerous trap, and people can end up sticking with a PhD at any cost, because to walk away from a PhD that isn't right for that particular person, or in some cases just isn't going to happen because of factors outside of your control, then they end up sacrificing more and more and more of themselves in order to seek that self-validation. So I think it's extremely important to recognize that it's not about showing how good you are at any cost. It's also about what you want from the PhD. Is the PhD serving that particular need? We all go in with particular expectations of what we want to get out of it, and then often the reality isn't exactly the same. So thinking about what you fundamentally want from the PhD, and then what you're willing to give in order to get it. How much sleep are you willing to give up on? How much social contact? Is it more important than a particular relationship? Is it worth giving up particular hobbies? And the thing to bear in mind is that paying a higher price doesn't guarantee success. So I think it's okay to compromise a little bit on some social contact. Maybe you do need to put in some longer hours. Maybe there are some things that you can't do. Maybe you can't go out drinking on a Wednesday night because you have to be at work the next day and it affects your performance. Maybe that's the price that you want to pay. That's okay. Cutting off all social contact is probably not a good thing, right? So you need to decide what you're willing to give up on, what you're not willing to give up on. And again, bearing in mind that the result is not guaranteed, even if you pay the highest price imaginable. Okay, so this is going to be important for some of the stuff that I'll talk about in the next session. So I just want to leave that as something for you to think about. But as a final point, just to kind of reinforce, you don't need a PhD for validation, right? You're already good enough, and whatever happens, you'll be okay. So if you forget everything else, just remember that. Okay, couple of quick resources if you're interested in the meditation side. Headspace is an app that's is probably the most famous and popular one. These are paid apps, but they've got really good introductory courses. And you can always do the free trial, do the introductory course, and then unsubscribe. But I think those basic skills are really, really, really important. So Headspace is kind of the most famous one. 10% Happier. They also have a free podcast, which has all sorts of different things. And there's another app called Waking Up. Free apps, there's one called Oak and one called Plum Village. These don't have as many resources, but if you want the free apps, they are available. So one very, very final point, I've said final point 3 times now, but this really is the final point, is that you don't have to do all of this on your own. You don't have to figure out all of this stuff on your own. And if you're really stressed, if things are really, really bad, seek help if you need it. That could be speaking to your friends, speaking to family, but then also maybe speaking to professionals who can really help deal with this stuff. Friends and family don't always know how to best help with these kind of situations. And they'll often say, oh, it's okay, everyone goes through this. You just keep going. It's not always the best advice. So seek help if you need it. Most universities have counseling services, or there are therapists all over the world. And there's one online platform called BetterHelp where you can find remote therapists as well. This is something that I've done personally, and it's made a huge difference. You don't have to figure it all out on your own. Okay, so let's get into the Q&A. So we've got about 40 minutes, just under 40 minutes. So you can ask me anything related to anything that I've spoken about, or really anything PhD related. We'll talk more about the time management side in the next session. These are some common topics, but you can kind of choose your own.
I might have one.
Sure.
So, luckily enough, I'm kind of an easygoing person, so to me, being stress is not something that really affects me.
Mm-hmm.
However, I find it hard to sometimes organize myself when I have parallel projects.
Yeah.
And it is not that I find difficult to observe which one should I finish first, but I find it difficult to actually follow the scheme that I might create to do that.
Yeah.
Because although I might see that, okay, I should perhaps finish this ASAP and then go with the what that is also this is one to complete and stuff. Sometimes while I am working at the easiest one, I think of an idea to complete the most difficult one, and sometimes I switch from one to another, and then I end up with having not completed any of them. So is there actually any kind of technique to actually say, okay, no, I'm going to...
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so this will be an issue that I'll talk about a little bit more in the next session, but to relate it to what I've talked about so far, one of the things I mentioned was in basic meditation, what you do is you sit for 10 minutes and you try and focus on the breath, and when your attention wanders, you bring your attention back to the breath. It's not really about focusing on the breath. It's about training your attention to notice when you get distracted and bring your attention back to whatever it is. So it's a generalizable skill. So in that instance where you've made a decision to work on a particular project, and then the thought comes into your mind, oh, maybe I do this with this other project. What I would suggest is just write down that idea and bring your attention back to what you were doing originally. Okay, so you have one point of focus, and it's inevitable your brain will jump around and think of all kinds of things. That's how brains work. But the ability to bring your attention back to that particular task and follow through, it really just comes through practice. The technique of just writing the ideas down, obviously that helps you to remember whatever idea it was. But you can also use that technique if, instead of being tempted to check to work on the other project, you're maybe tempted to check email, right? So for different people, there'll be different things, or whatever it is whatever temptation arises. Then if you write down, one of the things that I'll often do is I'll write down all the distractions, right? So I'm tempted to check email. So I'll start work. Let's say I start work at 9:30. Okay, I'm going to get this done. I'm going to write this presentation or whatever it is. 9:31. Oh, maybe I'll just check if I've got a reply from somebody about that call that I've got, whatever it is. And instead of doing it, I just write it down. Then, so it creates a little bit of a barrier between the thought and the actual response. So one of the problems with technology is we have the instant gratification, the gap between having the thought and finding something is basically zero. So just putting in a little bit of a gap. Then it will be 9:32, tempted to check email, right? So the distractions or those thoughts come really fast initially, but then gradually it settles down. Or actually quite quickly it settles down. So within 5-10 minutes. And then the level of focus and attention on what I'm actually doing tends to increase. So same technique, same idea, but you can apply it in different ways to slightly different problems. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions? We have plenty of time, so.
Yeah, actually, I have a question. You talk about how to deal with your own expectations, like, okay, I have to do more, I'm feeling that I'm not working enough and so on. And that's clear, okay, you should meditate and say, okay, no, I'm good enough and so on. What if those expectations come from an external input, like your supervisor or whatever, and you say to you, okay, it's better if you do this and this and this, but you are just working 100% of your possibilities?
Yeah, okay. Common problem, yeah. I think in that situation, if you're at 100% and your supervisor is giving you more and more things to do, you have to communicate with your supervisor and discuss it, right? Because the alternative is to just say yes to everything, and then from the supervisor's point of view, it's just, well, clearly you can handle this, right? You're taking on more and more. And they've got other stuff to think about. They've got their own research. They've got a million other things. So if you're at 100%, instead of saying, right, I'll get straight to that, and then you switch, you drop what you were doing, and you just work on this other project or whatever it is, and then something else comes up. So your supervisor then suggests something else. I think it's your responsibility to say, okay. I understand that might be important, but right now I'm working 100% on this thing. I think I should get that done first. So how about I get to that thing in a month's time, right? Something like that. And you can discuss it as professionals. You don't have to just do everything that they suggest. Obviously, it depends on your supervisor's character. Maybe they do expect you to drop everything and do it. But often, it's possible to discuss these things. In my own experience, with my PhD supervisor, who was really great person to work with, the problem that I often had was he was so quick and so intelligent that I would go in to have a discussion about one thing, and he would throw 10 different ideas at me. And I'd come out realizing that I hadn't actually even got to ask the question that I originally went in to ask, right? So I'd come out with all of these things, and I'd feel a little bit overloaded. But then I eventually realized what was happening, and these are just all the thoughts that have popped into his head, and it's up to me to decide what I actually do, or to ask, is that what is of these things, what is actually the most important, or what is the priority, or what should I do first, or in some cases saying that's really not going to be possible in the time we have available, right? And those discussions, often supervisors quite like it because it takes the pressure off them, because you're doing some of the thought and making some of those decisions, or bringing your own opinions on some of those things. So yeah, I'd say discuss it and negotiate what is the priority. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to ask basically what's your suggestion when all of these things add up, because you can have a problem, come down, be aware of the problem, but there's like a tiny bit of state.
Yeah.
And then all of that adds up to I don't know, a breaking point or something. And that's, I don't know, to my experience, for example, something more difficult to handle than just an everyday problem, like a point where you just have too much on your plate and you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that, even if you do all this stuff, that's probably going to happen, right? At some point, doing these things perfectly, there will be times when things just build up, or maybe a lot of stuff happens at the same time that was outside of your control, that you just have to somehow deal with. And I think really the thing to do initially is always to step back, just slow down, right? Give yourself a little bit of time to think, because I mean, ultimately you can only really do one thing at a time, right? Even if we think of multitasking, maybe like driving a car and having a conversation you can do, because the car driving is kind of an automated skill. But when you're doing research or these complicated things, really you can only do one thing at a time. So it's taking a step back, maybe taking stock of all of these things. So just writing them down so they're out of your mind and you can see them, right? And then what you have to do is basically decide, right, what's first? What am I going to deal with first? What can I deal with first? And dealing with that particular thing. There will be some things where maybe you just have to decide not to do those things. So I think a good sign in a PhD is if you have more ideas than you can possibly execute. Because the alternative is this is all the ideas I have, right? Which is not a good thing. So the vast majority of people that I've spoken to, even if the project starts quite simple, you do one thing and it raises 3 more questions, or you read one paper and it, in the bibliography you've got 10 more that you find that you need to read. So it just grows and grows and grows and grows. And so there has to be this kind of simplifying where you're constantly deciding, okay, this is the priority, but also these 10 things I'm just not going to do, right? Or maybe I'll do them in my postdoc, right? Or maybe I'll get somebody else to do that particular thing. So yeah, I think if we're talking about just tasks building up, then that would be the way to do it. Step back, take stock, decide what to prioritize, cut some things out, decide not to do them. If we're talking about emotional stress building up, that's something where it's really good to be aware of it, because, as I said, it will come out in some way or another, right? So even if you manage to hold the work together, maybe it will come out in other areas of your life. I noticed, again, sort of in the 3rd year of my PhD, when the stress was really building, before I'd had this kind of breakdown and revelation, I was just walking down the corridor one day, and one of the first-year PhD students just said to me, "Oh, have you got the microscope working yet?" And I just lost it. I was so angry, just because he said it with a smile on his face as well, and it was kind of this sarcastic comment. And yeah, I just let him have it. I got really, really angry with the guy. I apologized after, but it was just an example of, it wasn't really about what he said. It was more about like, this has just poked me in a way that's released all of this pressure that's built up. That didn't have any major consequences. As I said, I apologized. He understood. Hopefully, he didn't do it again with a stressed third-year PhD student. But yeah, it can also affect other areas of your life. It can affect personal relationships. It can, if you're stressed at work and then it comes out, it's, with your partner, that's a bad thing. So that's something that we need to, I think constantly need to try and reset, so that it doesn't come out in those kind of ways. Yeah, I'll come to you next. Yeah.
I would like to ask about like the wheel of the anxiety, like when you have like some deadlines and you start getting anxious because you feel the pressure. And for me, and I think for many people, like these are anxious that doesn't let you work. Like for example, in my specific case, I am in the third year of the PhD also, and I didn't publish yet, so I am writing my first paper, but I didn't publish, so I feel sometimes the pressure like, okay, the time is finishing, and also maybe my supervisor is a bit deception, or he wants me to get more results, and things are going so slow, and like you start thinking into that. So it's like you feel you should do more things and you should finish things earlier, but also because of these thinkings you can do it.
Yeah.
Like, do you have some advice to go out of that? And I mean, like for example, your breaking point and so.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, it's a classic example of that kind of, thinking a particular way, then results in the thing that you're afraid of actually becoming more likely, right? So if the anxiety about not getting it done in time stops you from working, or slows you down or distracts you, then you end up steering towards that particular outcome. So I think that a lot of the time these kind of thought patterns or emotional patterns, we try to suppress them, right? So it's like, no, I'm not going to think that. I'm just going to do the work, right? So you just like push it down, but it's still there. So I would say give yourself a little bit of time to actually sit with those thoughts and the emotions that are associated with them. So on the surface level, you have this deadline, you've got the external pressure, maybe from your supervisor. There was one thing you said about, I think you said maybe your supervisor will ask for more things, right? So has your supervisor actually asked for more things, or is that a scenario that you're creating in your own head?
I think it's more like own feelings, like maybe your supervisor didn't say anything, but you in your thought or in your mind are thinking like, okay, these things should have been done much earlier, and like this week I had a meeting and I just told him like, okay, all the experiments failed, so I have the feeling that okay, this week I didn't do anything.
Right. Okay, so it's worth digging into this a little bit further, right? So you did the experiments, you did the work, they didn't work, but then how do you feel about yourself in that situation?
I don't know, maybe it really depends on the time, like, okay, because sometimes you have these feelings and then something happened that, okay, you achieved something and now you again feel good and so. But at that situation, sometimes for me it's like, okay, maybe or I don't deserve this, or maybe it has reached a point where, okay, like I have deception my supervisor, and now it's like, okay, anything matters.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the underneath it, there's that feeling of like maybe I don't deserve this, and I'm sure there's probably other deeper things. And we're not going to do like a therapy session in front of 20 other people, so I won't dig any further. But that particular thought can have massive consequences. So a common thing that people talk about is imposter syndrome. This feeling that I'm not good enough, I don't deserve to be here. I've taken somebody else's funding for a PhD. All of these kind of things. And then, and I think often there's a certain amount of shame attached with that particular feeling, like, because you've got that, and also a lot of internal conflict because you have that belief, but then you're also still here. So part of you believes that I should be good enough, right, to do this thing. And whenever you have two opposing beliefs, it's always stressful, and often results in a kind of just freezing effect, right? So you can't actually then do anything. So again, I think it's good to kind of sit with that feeling. Actually let yourself, if you feel a bit of shame, let yourself feel it instead of suppressing it. Acknowledge it, give it some space to breathe, see how it feels within your body. And then think about, well, what's an alternative way of feeling or thinking about this? What if we think the opposite, right? And maybe you could think about it. You could think about it as, yes, I deserve this. Or you could think about, it doesn't matter whether I deserve this. I'm here, so let's just get on with it and see what happens. Which is maybe a more useful way of thinking about it. So we want to get to a point where it's kind of you're doing the work and you're engaged with it, but you also kind of treat it lightly. So it's not the result of it. It doesn't determine your value. Doesn't determine whether or not you deserve to be. It doesn't even determine like your current state of happiness or frustration or whatever else. It's just something you're doing. It's just a game. Let's just see what happens. It's one of these things that's easier said than done because you've got to overcome this kind of pattern of thinking. But sometimes just saying, to hell with it. I don't care what my supervisor thinks. I'm just going to do this to the best of my ability, and we'll see how it turns out. And if it all goes wrong, if my supervisor tears up the paper and kicks me out or whatever it is, I'll be okay. I'll be okay. And if you've got that belief, then if you have that belief, then you will be. And if you have the opposite belief, then you won't. I'll leave it at that. Okay. Yes, you had a question as well.
Well, I think we kind of touched upon it also, but I was going to go back to the thing that you mentioned about identity. And, well, basically, I went through all that, and maybe part of the good process. I'm not going to say I got there, but I got to that point. And maybe I'm getting there, but what I was going to say, so talking about the identity and like how it, I think it's something similar to what you said about when you just realize that it's going to be okay and you sort of relieve the pressure, then you can sort of, it doesn't mean that you don't care about it, you're still doing the things, but you're less distracted and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. But I think with the same with the identity, no? But I think that the identity goes a little bit deeper than that.
Yeah.
Like, and the identity doesn't apply just to this, to everything in life. I think. but still, like, have you like, what is the best coping strategy or something? And you're supposed to let it go, no? In the end.
Yes, yeah. That's so there's an interest. I mean, there's what I think is always kind of a funny double meaning around submitting a thesis, right? So you submit as in hand it over, but you also submit as in I give up. I let go. Whatever happens, happens. I submit to your judgment. So yeah, the identity issue. There's multiple layers to this. So I might actually end up just speaking about this for the next 10 minutes, but one of the ways that identity comes into it is your identity as a student or PhD student or academic, which is kind of deep rooted, right? So if you start school, let's say at the age of 5, and then you go all the way through. I mean, in my case, I just went straight through to a PhD. I basically never left school. From the age of 5, where you're quite impressionable, you do well on a spelling test, and you get the gold star, right? In my case, in my primary school, we actually had different tables based on your ability, right? So if you're on you had the clever table, and let's be honest, we had the not so clever table, right? And that's your identity, which is reinforced by the adult authority figure. And then you go home and you show your grades and you get praise from your parents. And so your value is to a large extent tied up with your academic performance. And so you go all the way through school. If you're in this room, presuming you all did quite well in all of your exams, you were on the clever table, right, throughout all that time. You go to university where you specialize in a subject, and again, you're at the top, maybe out of 100 people in your class or however many. And then you go through to a PhD, and suddenly you're struggling maybe for the first time, right? I'm guessing some of you have never failed an exam. I mean, I have, but for the rest of you. So when you really, really, really put all your effort into something and it just doesn't work, what does that do? It's the first time, and maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I don't deserve to be here. It's a really, really powerful thing. But again, if you're aware of that, then you have a chance, I think, of starting to overcome it, starting to think in different ways, starting to attach your value and your self-esteem to other things. For example, instead of academic achievement, maybe how you treat other people, right? As a pretty good thing, because that's what most people will remember about you. There are plenty of people with PhDs who are not very nice, right? So I think that's probably more important. I mean, I talked about this idea of control and safety. And the fundamental nature of research is you don't know how it's going to turn out. If you knew what the answer would be, then it's not very interesting research. So if you want to be on this path, if you want to be an academic, you have to be okay with making mistakes. You have to be okay with sometimes looking stupid. But you have to be okay with investing time in things that just doesn't work, and try to develop the attitude that I can deal with that. This is what I'm strong enough to deal with things going wrong, and the faith in yourself that this goes wrong, but I'll try something else. And if the whole academic career goes wrong, I'll try something else. I've got lots of if you've got lots of interests and you're all intelligent people, you will find something else that might actually work out better. And we attach so much to this particular outcome that often we don't see that maybe there's a different path. The thing that excites you about academia, maybe, if you detach it from that specific subject, maybe it's just solving difficult problems. You can do that in all sorts of different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be this one. So yeah, a little bit of detachment, a little bit of letting go from the particular outcome or the particular path that you're currently on. You may not see what those other paths are, but the belief that you'll find them and that they are actually there, I think, is you can take reassurance from that. Yeah, and so yeah, in terms of the identity, I think detaching yourself from those particular outcomes, I think, is important. As a slight diversion, I'll try and be quick so we can fit in another question, right? This actually relates to a podcast that I was listening to yesterday on the flight to come here. And what the guy was talking about was trying to be 100% yourself, which is kind of an interesting thing, because so often we're trying to please other people with, how does my supervisor want me to be, or, in all kinds of other interactions as well. And so quite often we'll suppress aspects of ourselves in order to please other people. But it often leads to stress and misery, right? Because you're not fully expressing yourself. So if we think, more broadly or more fundamentally about just basic happiness, having the confidence to just be yourself in every situation, I think is a really, really important thing. But the price of it is that some people, the way the guy in the podcast expressed it is that the price of it is that sometimes you'll be rejected. Sometimes people won't like, the genuine you. But you've got to be okay with that. So it's something that I'm thinking about trying to work on, but I think it's an interesting idea. Okay, we've got time for one more question.
Curious about I have two questions for different, but I choose one of them. And this is how to manage the fact to be far from home, from friends, and manage this during years or probably the entire life.
Yeah. Where are you from?
I'm from Italy.
Italy. Okay. So not too far, but
No,
still,
yes, but,
yeah.
I have
No, I was just curious. Okay. Yeah. So it's a common issue, and I often encounter it with people who are the other way, actually. So doing a PhD remotely, all right, and so they end up quite isolated from colleagues. But in your case, being here, being separated from friends and family, I think that to some extent, this is just the way that it is. You're here and they're there, but then creating opportunities or creating some time, because it's clearly important to you to see and spend time with those people, right? So taking some time just away from the PhD and go home and see them, right? Take time off over Christmas. And often, I don't know if this is the case for you, but often people think that they can't take time off. I have to keep working. But nothing bad is going to happen if you take 2 weeks for Christmas and you just tell your supervisor, I'm going to be out of contact for 2 weeks. And then when you're there, don't try and read papers. Don't try to work on some proof or something. Just be there 100% and come back refreshed, and then you'll pick up the work and, you'll have that time, right? So make that time for yourself, because it's super important. And the other thing I would say is make connections here. It won't maybe be as deep as, really old friendships or family connections. But I often say this to people generally, even if you're not a long way from home, get to know everyone in the department. At least, superficially, find out their names, find out what they work on, right? Be interested in other people. You want to be walking down the corridor and, you say hello to everybody. It's really, really easy to spend 3 or 4 years in the same building, pass the same person every day, and you don't even know their name, right? This was certainly the case for me, because I was really, really, really insanely, ridiculously shy. Had real kind of social anxiety. But through a lot of this kind of work and meditation and all of this kind of stuff, managed to overcome it. And now in the co-working where I work most of the time, when I walk in, I'm saying hello to 20, 30 people, right? Some of them are friends, some of them are just kind of, they're acquaintances, but it feels so much better. And if you know what they do, if you show interest in what they do, they're likely to show interest in you, and then it just builds and builds, and it becomes this really, really nice. Coming to work becomes a nice experience around all of that stress. So those would be my 2 suggestions. Okay. Oh, I'll add one thing to that. A lot of people find that difficult, getting to know everybody. It's so easy. You don't need any tricks of conversation. If you see somebody at the coffee machine, say, "Hi, I'm," whatever your name is, right? Hold out your hand, and that's it. That's all it takes. And most people walk around with this kind of shell around them. And when you start noticing that, it's really, really, really obvious. And most people are waiting for that shell to be cracked. All they need is a little excuse. Some people are not that sociable, but you'll find that the vast majority of people will really, really, really appreciate it. Okay, it's super easy. Okay, and it gets easier with practice as well. Okay, so let's leave it there. The next session will be